All right, so are you ready for this? Today we're going to do a deep dive into one of those stories that just grabs you and won't let go, the Chernobyl disaster.
Mhm.
We've got research and firsthand accounts and all the technical details and even some of the unexpected consequences.
Mm.
And, it's a story that's both fascinating and tragic. Now, you've probably heard about Chernobyl, but we're going to go beyond the headlines today. We're going to uncover the chain of events, like all the decisions that led up to this disaster.
Well, what's so captivating about Chernobyl is that it really does unravel kind of like a suspense novel, you know? It
Mm.
wasn't just one massive mistake. It was a bunch of smaller choices and these like technical quirks that all kind of built up and ended up creating this huge catastrophe. And it all started on what seemed like a totally normal night at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant back in 1986.
Okay, so paint us a picture. April 25th, 1986, reactor number 4. They were running a routine safety test, and we know how that turned out. But what's really interesting is how a test designed to make the plant safer ended up causing the exact opposite.
Yeah, well, the design of the reactor itself plays a really big role here. It was called an RBMK 1000 reactor. And it had this strange feature. It's called a positive void coefficient. And to put it simply, it means that if steam bubbles formed in the cooling water, it could actually speed up the nuclear reaction. It's kind of counterintuitive, like trying to put out a fire with gasoline.
So even before any human error was involved, you're telling me there was a design flaw built into the system itself.
Yeah, it's pretty crazy.
Wow. And then on top of that, you have this safety test, which was supposed to see if the momentum of the turbine could keep those cooling pumps running, if there was a power outage, like a backup plan.
Exactly, and it was a very important backup plan. The whole idea was to gradually reduce power, let the turbines spin down, and see if that would give them enough time for those backup generators to kick in. Seemed pretty simple on paper, but the test was supposed to be done during the day shift, but it ended up being handed off to the night shift.
Ah, okay, and I bet that shift change had some unintended consequences, right?
Oh yeah, for sure. The test got delayed because another power station went offline. So Chernobyl had to pick up the slack and couldn't lower power as planned. So the night shift inherited this delayed test, and they had even less time to prepare.
Oh, man. So now we've got this reactor with this weird design quirk
Mhm.
and a rushed test that everyone's trying to complete. What happened next?
Well, this is where the whole chain of events starts to get really interesting. As part of the test prep, they had to disable the emergency core cooling system. It was standard procedure. But because of all the delays, this system stayed offline longer than it should have. Now, to be fair, the system wouldn't have prevented a meltdown completely, but it says a lot about the overall safety culture at the plant.
So we've got a flawed reactor, a test that everyone's rushing to get done,
Mm.
and a critical safety system that's offline. You can feel the tension building here. Did they realize how dangerous this situation was becoming?
It seems like there was a lot of confusion and a lot of miscommunication going on. They finally started to reduce power, aiming for 700 megawatts, but then they ran into this problem called xenon poisoning. It basically means that a byproduct of nuclear fission starts building up and absorbing neutrons, which slows down the chain reaction.
So the reactor's power kept dropping, even though they were trying to lower it.
Exactly.
Okay, so what did they do to try to regain control?
Well, they tried to compensate by removing control rods, which basically boosts the reactor's power. You can almost think of it like trying to slow down a car by pressing the gas pedal.
That doesn't sound like the best strategy.
Yeah.
What were the risks involved in removing those control rods?
Yeah, so with almost all of the control rods removed and the cooling water getting really close to boiling, the reactor was in a super unstable state. And remember that positive void coefficient we talked about? Well, any increase in steam bubbles at this point would basically send the reactor spiraling towards a runaway chain reaction.
Okay, so they're walking this tightrope, trying to keep the reactor from going too low or too high. What happened when they finally started the test?
They cut off the steam to the turbine to simulate a power outage, and that's when another really critical design flaw showed up. The control rods, the ones that were supposed to shut down the reactor in an emergency, actually had graphite tips. And graphite, instead of absorbing neutrons like water does, it actually helps moderate them.
Wait, so they hit the brakes, and instead of slowing down, the reactor actually sped up.
Exactly. And this design quirk, it was actually known to cause power surges, but it wasn't properly addressed in the reactor's safety protocols. So when the operator hit that emergency shutdown button, the AZ5 button, it was already too late.
Oh, wow, that's chilling. So what happened next?
So instead of shutting down, the reactor was pushed even further towards criticality. And that power surge, it fractured the fuel rods, which caused this massive steam explosion that blew the reactor's heavy steel lid right off. And that was just the first explosion.
There was a second explosion.
Yeah, and it was even more powerful than the first one. This second explosion scattered the reactor core and basically spewed all this radioactive material high up into the atmosphere. So now you have this raging fire in the reactor core, radioactive debris everywhere, and a cloud of deadly contamination spreading.
Wow. It's hard to even imagine the chaos and confusion in those first few moments.
Uh-huh.
What about the people nearby? Did they know what was going on?
The nearby city of Pripyat, they were totally unaware of what was happening. It was a peaceful Saturday night, and lots of people were out enjoying the spring weather, totally oblivious to this invisible threat.
And what about the first responders, the firefighters who rushed to the scene?
Those firefighters, a lot of them ended up paying the ultimate price for their bravery. They charged right into that inferno with very little understanding of the danger they were facing. They were incredibly courageous in the face of this threat they couldn't even see.
It's just heartbreaking and inspiring at the same time. Were there any accounts from those on the front lines that you came across in your research?
There are so many stories, but one that's always stuck with me is a firefighter describing the sensation of radiation exposure as tasting like metal. Can you imagine?
That's just, wow. It's a chilling reminder of this invisible enemy they were fighting.
Yeah.
And they weren't the only heroes that night, were they?
Absolutely not. The reactor crew, even though they were getting wildly inaccurate readings from their radiation detectors, they worked tirelessly trying to pump water into the reactor to try and cool it down. And they also paid a heavy price for their dedication.
So you have these everyday people, just regular folks, facing this unimaginable situation, putting their lives on the line to contain this disaster. What steps were taken to manage the aftermath of the explosion?
Well, the Soviet authorities, they had this monumental task in front of them. They had to contain the radioactive fallout and try to mitigate the damage. It was a challenge unlike anything they had ever encountered before.
I mean, where do you even begin to tackle something of that magnitude?
It was like a scramble, They started by using helicopters to drop tons and tons of sand and lead and clay and even boron onto that burning reactor core. They were trying to smother the fire, prevent more radioactive material from escaping.
That's crazy. So you've got these helicopters flying over this reactor, just dumping all these materials. Did it actually work?
Well, it was a desperate measure, right? And we know now that very little of that stuff actually reached the core. The fire raged on for 10 days before it finally burned itself out.
10 days. Wow. It's hard to even fathom the scale of this whole disaster and the pressure those responders must have been under. So what happened after the fire was finally put out?
Well, then they had to figure out how to stop the spread of that radioactive contamination. They needed to seal off the reactor and protect the surrounding area from all that intense radiation. And that's where the sarcophagus comes in.
The sarcophagus, this giant concrete tomb, right, encasing the radioactive ruins. It's become like this iconic symbol of the disaster. What was it like building that thing?
Can you imagine working around the clock in this incredibly radioactive environment, building this massive concrete structure using cranes that are being operated remotely from these lead-lined cabins? I mean, it was this crazy engineering feat built under just insanely challenging conditions.
I mean, the sheer scale of this operation is mind-boggling. And they did all of this knowing it was only a temporary fix.
Right. Yeah, exactly. The sarcophagus was absolutely crucial for containing that immediate threat. But it was never meant to be a permanent solution. It was more like a Band-Aid to buy them some time.
And it did, to some extent.
Yeah.
But the story doesn't end there, does it?
Yeah.
What about the surrounding area? The nearby city of Pripyat, for example.
Pripyat, yeah. Once a bustling city with almost 50,000 people living there, it just stands as this haunting reminder of the human cost of this disaster. And the evacuation of Pripyat is another chapter in this whole story. It really shows you the impact this had on people's lives.
I can't imagine what it must have been like to be forced to leave your home, not knowing if you'd ever be able to return.
They only gave the evacuees a few hours to pack their things. They told them they'd be back in a few days, but they never went back.
It really puts things in perspective. The consequences of Chernobyl went way beyond that initial explosion and fire. What about the wider environmental impact? I've heard about the red forest, where all the pine trees died from the radiation. Was there any sign of recovery in the area?
Surprisingly, yes. While the initial impact on wildlife was devastating, some species have shown that they're remarkably resilient. The exclusion zone, it's largely abandoned now, right? Well, it's actually become this unexpected haven for wildlife.
That's amazing. It's like nature's reclaiming the land, adapting to the radiation. Does that mean the exclusion zone is safe for humans now?
Not really. The radiation levels in a lot of areas are still way too high for people to live there permanently. But the fact that there's all this thriving wildlife does make you wonder about the long-term effects of radiation on ecosystems.
So Chernobyl, a place of tragedy and loss, has also become this unlikely laboratory for studying how resilient nature can be. It seems like there are always these unexpected consequences, both good and bad, that come out of something this big. What about the reactor itself? Is it still a threat all these years later?
Well, the sarcophagus, as we mentioned, was only meant to be temporary. And over time, it started to deteriorate. People started to worry about whether it was still strong enough and if it could still contain all that radioactive debris.
So what did they do? Did they just leave it to fall apart?
No, they actually embark on another massive engineering project. They built a new containment structure, a bigger one. It's called the New Safe Confinement. It's this enormous arch-shaped structure that encloses the whole sarcophagus and the reactor remains. It was finished in 2016, and it's supposed to last for at least 100 years.
That's unbelievable. A testament to human ingenuity, even when faced with such a daunting challenge. What does this new structure mean for the future of Chernobyl?
Well, the new safe confinement will allow them to eventually dismantle the old sarcophagus and safely remove the radioactive debris. But decommissioning the Chernobyl reactor is a long and complicated process. It'll probably take decades to finish.
So Chernobyl, even after all these years, is still an ongoing challenge. It really makes you think about the immense power of nuclear energy and the consequences of what happened that night in 1986.
Absolutely. It's a story that's still unfolding as we learn more about the long-term effects of the disaster and as we continue to work on improving nuclear safety and figuring out what to do with nuclear waste.
Well, this deep dive into Chernobyl has been eye-opening, to say the least. It's a reminder that we need to learn from our past and that we need to prioritize safety above all else, and that we need to recognize the human cost of these kinds of technological disasters.
I agree. It's also a story about how resilient nature can be and the human spirit, too. And it shows you what we can achieve with innovation, even when we're faced with incredible adversity.
Well said. Thanks for joining us on this journey into one of history's most significant events. It's a story that continues to fascinate and challenge us. It makes us think about the complex relationship between humans and technology and the environment,